I still remember the exact words my granddaughter whispered on the phone that night, and the moment I heard them, I realized something about the last 7 years of my life might have been a lie. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and I was sitting alone in my kitchen in Ohio, finishing a cup of coffee after dinner when my phone rang. The number on the screen surprised me because it belonged to my granddaughter Emily. She was 15 at the time, and she almost never called me directly. Usually I spoke to her when her father, my son-in-law Daniel Harper, put the phone on speaker during holidays. I answered with a smile in my voice and said hello, expecting to hear the usual cheerful greeting. Instead, there was a long pause followed by a soft, nervous voice. Emily asked me a question that made no sense at first. She said, "Grandpa, why do you keep sending Dad money when we barely have food sometimes?" I sat there in silence for a few seconds because my mind refused to process what she had just said. For the last 7 years, I had sent Daniel $40,000 every year to help him raise Emily after my daughter Laura died. It was a promise I made to myself the day we buried her. Laura had been my only child, and losing her felt like someone had taken the foundation out from under my life. I remember standing beside Daniel after the funeral and telling him he wouldn't have to carry the burden alone. I had worked for more than 40 years running a small construction business, and I was fortunate enough to retire comfortably. Helping them felt like the right thing to do. Every January, I transferred $40,000 into Daniel's account without hesitation. He always thanked me and assured me the money went toward Emily's school tuition, activities, and a stable home. For 7 years, I never questioned it. But now I was sitting in my quiet kitchen listening to my granddaughter suggest that things were very different from what I had been told. I asked her gently what she meant, and she hesitated like she was afraid she had said something wrong. Emily explained that they had moved to a smaller apartment a few months earlier and that her father often talked about money problems. She told me sometimes he said they had to be careful with groceries and other expenses. As she spoke, I felt a strange pressure building in my chest. $40,000 a year was more than enough for a comfortable life in their town in Pennsylvania. I knew that because I had helped Daniel plan his budget after Laura passed away. At that time, he assured me the amount would cover school, rent, and everything Emily needed. I asked Emily what school she was attending now, and she gave me the name of a small local public school. That detail confused me even more because Daniel had told me every year that Emily was enrolled in a private academy with strong college preparation programs. I had even sent extra money once when he mentioned rising tuition costs. When Emily finished speaking, there was another long silence between us. I didn't want to alarm her, so I told her everything was probably just a misunderstanding and that she shouldn't worry. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said she thought I should know because her mom would have wanted me to know the truth. After the call, I remained at the kitchen table staring at my phone. My house felt unusually quiet that night. The promise I made to Laura had always given me a sense of peace because I believed I was protecting the family she left behind. But now a question had entered my mind that I could not ignore. If Emily was telling the truth, then where had all that money been going for the last 7 years? I walked to the window and looked out at the empty street while memories of Laura filled my thoughts. She had always trusted people easily, and she believed Daniel was a good man when she married him. For years I believed that too. Yet the uncertainty I felt that night refused to go away. I realized something simple but deeply unsettling. For 7 years I had trusted Daniel's words without ever asking for proof. And the only reason I was starting to question everything was because a 15-year-old girl had quietly asked me a single honest question. I barely slept that night after Emily called me. Her question kept repeating in my mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade. By morning, I was already sitting at the same kitchen table with a notebook, trying to think through everything calmly instead of letting emotions take control. For 7 years, I had followed the same routine. Every January, I opened my banking app, transferred $40,000 to Daniel Harper, and sent him a short message wishing him and Emily a good start to the year. Daniel always responded quickly with gratitude. He would tell me Emily was doing well in school and that the money helped cover tuition, books, and activities. Sometimes he mentioned soccer fees or school trips. I had never asked for details because I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Helping them made me feel like I was still protecting my daughter even though she was gone. Laura had been the kind of person who cared deeply about family. She used to say that as long as people looked out for each other, everything else would work itself out. After her accident, I held on to that idea. Supporting Daniel and Emily felt like honoring her memory. But now that simple routine suddenly looked different. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account to review the transfers. The numbers appeared exactly as I expected. $40,000 every January, sent on the same date, year after year. In total, it added up to $280,000. Seeing that number made me pause for a moment. That was a substantial amount of money, even for someone who had saved carefully over a lifetime. I tried to remember the conversations Daniel and I had during those years. Each time I asked how Emily was doing, he sounded relaxed and confident. He told me she attended a respected private academy in their town and that she was already thinking about college. I even remembered sending an additional $2,000 one year when he said the school had increased tuition costs. At the time, it felt completely reasonable. Now Emily was telling me she attended a public school and that they had recently moved into a smaller apartment because money was tight. The two stories simply did not fit together. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to call Daniel immediately and ask direct questions, but another part of me felt that would only give him time to prepare answers. Daniel had always been polite with me, but he was also someone who spoke very carefully when discussing finances. I had noticed that even years ago, he tended to explain things quickly and move the conversation forward before I could ask too many follow-up questions. That memory made me realize something important. If I wanted the truth, I needed to look for it quietly first. Later that afternoon, I drove to a small diner in town where I sometimes met an old friend named Michael Carter. Michael used to work as an accountant before retiring, and he understood financial records better than anyone I knew. Over coffee, I explained the situation without accusing Daniel of anything. I simply told him that my granddaughter had said something that did not match what I had been told. Michael listened carefully and nodded a few times while I spoke. When I finished, he said something that stayed with me. He said that when numbers and stories do not match, the numbers usually tell the real story. He suggested that I start by verifying simple facts like Emily's school enrollment and Daniel's housing situation. Those details were public enough that they could be confirmed without creating conflict. His calm advice made the situation feel less overwhelming. That evening, I returned home and thought again about the phone call with Emily. She had not sounded angry or dramatic. She sounded confused, almost worried that she had done something wrong by mentioning it. That detail convinced me she had no reason to invent a story. If anything, she had probably hesitated for weeks before finally telling me. As the sun went down outside my living room window, I realized the promise I made to Laura all those years ago still mattered. Protecting her daughter meant making sure the support I provided was truly helping Emily. If something had gone wrong during the past 7 years, then ignoring it would only make the problem worse. I decided that starting the next day, I would quietly begin verifying the details Daniel had told me about their life. I did not know yet what I would find, but for the first time in years, I felt a cautious determination forming in my mind. Something about the story I had been told no longer made sense, and I was finally ready to find out why. I woke up early the next morning with the same quiet determination that had settled in my mind the night before. The house was still dark and silent as I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table again. For years, my mornings had been simple and predictable, but now every detail of the past 7 years felt like something that needed to be examined more carefully. I opened my laptop and began with the simplest question first. If Emily was not attending the private academy Daniel had mentioned so many times, then verifying her school enrollment should be straightforward. The academy Daniel always talked about was called Westbridge Preparatory School. It was located about 15 miles from the small Pennsylvania town where Daniel and Emily lived. I knew the name well because Daniel had brought it up often during our phone calls. He described it as a place with strong academic programs and small classes that would help Emily prepare for college. I searched the school website and found a public directory with student activities and recent award announcements. I slowly scrolled through several pages looking for Emily Harper's name. After 10 minutes, I had not seen it once. That by itself did not prove anything, but it made me uneasy. I decided to call the school office directly. When the receptionist answered, I introduced myself politely and explained that I was confirming information about a family member. The woman on the phone was kind but professional. She asked for the student's full name and date of birth. I gave her Emily's information and waited while she checked their system. The silence on the line lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Finally, she returned and said something very clear and very simple. She told me there was no student named Emily Harper currently enrolled at Westbridge Preparatory School, and there had not been one during the past several years. I thanked her for the help and ended the call calmly, but I remained sitting in my chair for a long moment afterward. That single piece of information confirmed that at least one part of Daniel's story was not true. I tried to stay logical about it. There could be explanations. Perhaps Emily had transferred recently, or Daniel had changed schools without mentioning it. Still, the feeling in my chest told me the situation was becoming more serious than I had hoped. I decided to check the second detail Michael had suggested the day before, Daniel's housing situation. Over the years, Daniel had always told me they lived in the same townhouse that he and Laura had rented shortly after Emily was born. I remembered visiting once when Emily was still very young. It was a modest place but comfortable, located in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes outside Pittsburgh. If Emily had told me they moved to a smaller apartment recently, then there would likely be rental records or listings connected to Daniel's name. I spent the next hour searching property records and local listings online. Public housing information in that county was easier to access than I expected. After several searches, I found something that made me lean closer to the screen. The townhouse Daniel had described for years had been listed for rent under a different tenant nearly 8 months earlier. According to the listing history, Daniel Harper was no longer associated with that address. I continued searching until I found a newer rental record connected to his name. It showed a smaller apartment located about 3 miles away from the original townhouse. The rent listed for that apartment was significantly lower than the property Daniel had previously described. Emily's comment during the phone call suddenly made perfect sense. They had indeed moved somewhere smaller. What did not make sense was why Daniel never mentioned it. During our most recent phone call only 2 months earlier, he had spoken about their home as if nothing had changed. I closed the laptop again and walked to the window in my living room. Outside, the quiet suburban street looked exactly the same as it always did, but my thoughts felt much heavier than they had just a few days earlier. 2 pieces of information were now clearly different from what Daniel had told me. Emily was not attending the private academy he mentioned every year, and the home he claimed they still lived in had been rented to someone else months ago. I began to realize that my granddaughter's quiet warning had opened the door to questions I should have asked a long time ago. But the most troubling thought was still waiting in the back of my mind. If Daniel had not been paying private school tuition and had moved into a less expensive apartment, then the question became impossible to ignore. Where had $280,000 actually gone? The more I looked at the information I had gathered, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. For years I had trusted Daniel's explanations without hesitation, but now every small detail seemed to carry a different meaning. That afternoon I decided to call Daniel, not to accuse him of anything, but simply to listen carefully to how he explained their situation. When he answered the phone, he sounded exactly the same as always, relaxed and friendly. He greeted me warmly and asked how I had been doing. I kept my voice calm and told him I had been thinking about Emily and wanted to check in. I asked how school was going for her this semester. Daniel responded quickly and confidently, just like he always had. He said Emily was doing very well at Westbridge Preparatory School and that she had recently joined a science club that met after classes. I listened quietly while he spoke, but now that I knew the school had no record of Emily ever attending there, every word felt different. Instead of sounding reassuring, his explanations sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. I asked a few more simple questions about her classes and teachers. Daniel answered them easily, but none of the details he gave could be verified by anything I had seen. After a few minutes, I shifted the conversation to their living situation. I casually mentioned that I had been thinking about visiting Pennsylvania sometime during the summer and asked whether they were still living in the townhouse I remembered. There was a brief pause before Daniel replied. It was only a second or two, but it was the first hesitation I had heard from him during the call. He then told me they were still there and that the neighborhood was just as quiet as ever. That answer confirmed what I had already discovered online. Daniel was continuing the same story, even though I now knew it was not accurate. I ended the conversation politely and told him I hoped to see them both soon. When the call finished, I sat back in my chair feeling a strange mixture of disappointment and determination. The man I had trusted for 7 years had just repeated 2 statements that were clearly not true. Emily was not enrolled in the private academy he described, and the townhouse he claimed to still occupy had been rented to someone else months earlier. The situation was no longer just a misunderstanding. Something was being deliberately hidden. Later that evening, I drove to the diner again to meet Michael Carter. When I explained what I had learned, he listened carefully and nodded slowly. He told me that when people continue repeating the same story after facts begin to contradict it, that usually means they are protecting something larger. His advice was simple. He suggested that instead of confronting Daniel immediately, I should gather a clearer picture of Daniel's finances and lifestyle during the past several years. If the money I had sent was not paying for Emily's education or housing, then there would likely be signs of where it had gone. The idea made sense to me. For the first time, I realized that the situation might require patience rather than confrontation. If Daniel believed I still trusted his explanations, he would have no reason to change his behavior. That meant I could quietly observe without raising suspicion. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to small details I had ignored before. I reviewed old messages Daniel had sent me about expenses and school events. I noticed how often he mentioned tuition payments and academic programs. At the time, those messages had reassured me. Now they felt like carefully constructed updates designed to keep me from asking deeper questions. One message from 3 years earlier caught my attention in particular. Daniel had written that Emily's school had introduced a new advanced learning program that required additional fees. I remembered sending him an extra $2,000 that same week to help with the cost. Sitting there reading that message again made me wonder how many similar explanations I had accepted without verification. By the end of the week, I understood something that made the entire situation more troubling. If Daniel had not been paying private school tuition and had moved into a smaller apartment with lower rent, then his monthly expenses would have been far lower than what I had assumed for years. Yet every January he had accepted another $40,000 from me without hesitation. That realization raised a question that had been quietly forming since Emily called me. If the money was not being used for Emily's education or for maintaining their home, then Daniel must have been using it for something else entirely. And the more I thought about that possibility, the more certain I became that the truth about the past 7 years was going to be far more complicated than I had ever imagined. Over the next several days, I continued looking into Daniel's situation without telling anyone what I was doing. I wanted to understand the full picture before I made any decisions. Each morning I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and reviewed the information I had already gathered. The pattern was beginning to feel clear, even though I still lacked the final pieces. Daniel had not been paying private school tuition, and he had moved into a smaller apartment months earlier, while continuing to describe the old townhouse as if nothing had changed. That meant the $40,000 I had been sending every year had not been used for the reasons he always described. The question that remained was simple but unsettling. Where had the money actually gone? One afternoon, I remembered something Daniel mentioned during one of our conversations about 2 years earlier. At the time, he casually told me he had started exploring a few business opportunities on the side. I had not thought much about it then because many people try small investments or side projects. But now that memory stood out in a different way. If Daniel had used the money I sent to build something for himself, there might be records connected to his name. I opened my laptop again and began searching public business registrations in Pennsylvania. The state database allowed anyone to view recently formed companies and their owners. I typed Daniel Harper's name into the search field and waited while the results loaded. At first, nothing appeared, but after adjusting the search slightly, I noticed a small entry connected to a limited liability company formed about 3 years earlier. The company name was Harper Coastal Ventures. Seeing Daniel listed as the registered owner made me lean closer to the screen. According to the filing information, the business had been active for several years and listed an address that I did not recognize. It was not connected to the apartment where Daniel currently lived. Curious, I copied the address and searched it separately. The location turned out to be connected to a marina along the eastern coast of Florida. That discovery surprised me enough that I read the information twice to make sure I had not misunderstood it. A marina property in Florida was not something I would have expected Daniel to be involved with, especially considering he had told me multiple times that money had been tight while raising Emily. I continued reading through the public records until I found another detail that caught my attention. The company had recently purchased a small recreational boat registered under the same business name. I leaned back in my chair trying to process what that meant. A boat and a coastal business location suggested that Daniel had been investing in something far beyond the modest lifestyle he described to me every year. The contrast between those two images became impossible to ignore. On one hand, Daniel spoke about financial pressure and careful budgeting for Emily's needs. On the other hand, there was now a registered company connected to a marina property hundreds of miles away. Later that evening, I called Michael again and explained what I had discovered. He listened quietly as I described the company registration and the Florida address. When I finished, he gave a thoughtful pause before responding. Michael explained that forming a limited liability company and purchasing property through it was a common way people structured investments. There was nothing illegal about it by itself. However, he also pointed out something important. If Daniel had used the money I sent for those investments while telling me it was being used for Emily's education and living expenses, that would mean he had been misleading me for years. Hearing those words spoken out loud made the situation feel much more real. I walked outside onto my back porch after the call ended and looked out across the quiet yard behind my house. The late evening air was cool and still. I thought about Laura and the promise I made to protect the family she left behind. Every decision I had made during the past 7 years came from that promise. I believed I was helping my granddaughter build a secure future. Now I was beginning to realize that the money may have been building something else entirely. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I understood that the truth was slowly revealing itself piece by piece. The school story had been false. The housing story had been false. And now there was evidence suggesting Daniel had been quietly building a business far from Pennsylvania while continuing to accept $40,000 from me every single year. The more I thought about it, the clearer one realization became. If Daniel truly believed I trusted him completely, then he would never expect me to look any deeper into what he had been doing. And that realization gave me an idea that would soon change the direction of everything. I spent the next few days thinking carefully about what I had discovered and what it meant for the future. The more I reviewed the information about Daniel's company and the marina property in Florida, the more certain I became that the money I had sent for Emily's well-being had likely been used for something very different. Yet despite everything I had learned, I knew confronting Daniel too quickly would not help Emily. If he realized that I had started investigating him, he might become defensive or hide whatever financial trail still existed. What I needed was patience and a clear plan. Late one evening, I called Michael again and told him I wanted advice before taking any further steps. We spoke for nearly an hour while he explained how situations like this often unfold. He reminded me that when someone believes they are trusted completely, they usually continue behaving exactly the same way. That idea stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Daniel believed I had no reason to doubt him. For 7 years, I had accepted every explanation he offered without hesitation. If I suddenly started asking direct questions about the company in Florida or the missing school tuition, the entire situation would immediately become confrontational. Instead, I decided to do the opposite. I would continue acting exactly as I always had. The following morning, I sent Daniel a friendly message asking how Emily was doing and mentioning that I hoped she was enjoying her classes. His reply came quickly, just as it always did. He wrote that Emily was doing very well at school and that she was already thinking about college options. Reading those words again made me realize how confident he was that his story remained believable. That confidence gave me an opportunity one had not considered before. If Daniel truly believed I trusted him completely, then he would have no reason to question anything I said next. A few days later, I called him again and spoke in the same calm tone I had used during our earlier conversations. I told him I had been reviewing my finances and thinking about Emily's future. I explained that since she was getting older, I wanted to help create a stronger college fund for her. Daniel immediately sounded enthusiastic. He said that was a wonderful idea and that college expenses had been something he worried about recently. I listened carefully to the excitement in his voice. It sounded genuine, but now I understood that his enthusiasm might have had more to do with money than with Emily's education. That was when I introduced the idea I had been considering since my conversation with Michael. I told Daniel that instead of sending the usual $40,000 this year, I was thinking about transferring a much larger amount at once to help prepare for Emily's future. I mentioned the number casually as if I had only just begun thinking about it. I told him I was considering sending $200,000 to start a proper college fund for Emily. The reaction on the other end of the phone was immediate. Daniel paused for a moment and then thanked me several times in a row. He said Emily would be incredibly grateful and that this would give her opportunities most students never had. As he continued talking, I realized something important. He never once suggested placing the money directly into a protected education account or discussing it with a financial advisor. Instead, he simply accepted the idea that the money would come through him just like it always had. That response confirmed what I needed to know. Daniel had become comfortable receiving my support without expecting any questions about how it was used. When the call ended, I felt a calm sense of clarity settle over my thoughts. The situation had moved beyond suspicion. Now it required a careful plan to ensure that the truth would come out in a way that protected Emily and prevented any further misuse of the money. The next step was simple but extremely important. If Daniel believed a large transfer was coming soon, he would naturally prepare to receive it. And if he prepared for it, there would be an opportunity to show exactly how he intended to use it. Later that evening, I called Michael once again and told him about the conversation. After listening to the details, he gave a quiet laugh and said the situation might soon reveal more information than Daniel ever intended. For the first time since Emily's phone call, I felt that the uncertainty of the past week was beginning to turn into something more focused. The truth had been hidden for years, but now Daniel himself was about to help reveal it without even realizing what he was doing. I spent the next week moving forward with the plan while keeping everything as normal as possible in my conversations with Daniel. Each time we spoke, he sounded relaxed and optimistic, almost energized by the idea of the larger transfer I had mentioned. He talked about Emily's future, about how college costs were rising every year, and how grateful he was that I was willing to help prepare for it. Listening to him speak like that was a strange experience now that I understood how many details of his story had already fallen apart. Still, I kept my tone warm and supportive because the success of the plan depended on him believing nothing had changed between us. During that same week, Michael helped me organize the next step. He suggested bringing in someone with legal experience to make sure everything was handled properly. Through one of his contacts, we arranged a meeting with an attorney named Linda Carver, who specialized in financial documentation and family trust arrangements. When I explained the situation to her, she listened carefully and took several notes before offering a very clear suggestion. She said that if I truly wanted to see how Daniel intended to handle the money, the best way would be to invite him to sign a formal document acknowledging the transfer and describing how it would be used. Linda explained that people who have been acting dishonestly often become careless when they believe they are about to receive a large amount of money. The paperwork would give him the opportunity to reveal exactly what he expected to control. Her advice made sense to me, and we began preparing a simple agreement stating that the $200,000 would be transferred for the purpose of supporting Emily's future education. The document itself was straightforward, but Linda added one important detail. The agreement also required Daniel to confirm that all previous funds I had sent for Emily had been used for her education and living expenses. She explained that if he signed such a statement without hesitation, it would reveal how confident he was that his story would never be questioned. Over the next few days, everything was arranged quietly. Linda prepared the paperwork, and Michael helped review the financial records I had gathered. The more we organized the information, the clearer the timeline became. For 7 years, Daniel had accepted $40,000 annually, while providing explanations about tuition, housing, and school activities that did not match the facts we had uncovered. Meanwhile, the company in Florida had slowly expanded, including the purchase of the recreational boat connected to the marina address. When I looked at the timeline laid out on paper, it felt less like a misunderstanding and more like a carefully maintained illusion. Still, one important piece remained. Daniel needed to appear in person to complete the agreement for the new transfer. I called him again and told him I would be traveling to Pennsylvania soon to visit Emily and discuss the college fund in more detail. He immediately agreed and said Emily would be excited to see me. I could hear genuine warmth in his voice when he mentioned her, which made the entire situation even more complicated emotionally. Whatever mistakes Daniel had made, Emily was still the person I wanted to protect the most. A few days later, I drove the 300 miles from Ohio to Pennsylvania, taking the same highway route I had traveled years earlier when Laura was still alive. The drive gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since then. When I finally arrived in town, I checked into a small hotel near the center of the city and called Daniel to let him know I had arrived safely. He suggested we meet the next afternoon at a quiet cafe not far from where he lived. The following day, I arrived early and chose a table near the window. Linda and Michael were seated at another table across the room so that they could observe without making Daniel uncomfortable. The folder containing the prepared documents rested quietly on the table in front of me. When Daniel walked in a few minutes later, he greeted me with the same friendly smile I had seen for years. We shook hands and sat down together while the waitress brought us coffee. For the first few minutes we spoke about Emily, about school activities, and about everyday life. Daniel seemed completely at ease, unaware that the conversation was slowly moving toward the moment that would finally reveal what the past 7 years had really been about. As I looked at the folder on the table, I realized something important. In just a few minutes, Daniel would have the opportunity to confirm everything he had been telling me for years, or reveal the truth he believed I would never discover. Daniel picked up his coffee and smiled as if the afternoon was nothing more than a pleasant family meeting. For a moment, I watched him carefully, noticing how comfortable he seemed sitting across from me. For 7 years, he had spoken to me with the confidence of someone who believed his story would never be questioned. Now that confidence was about to face its first real test. I began the conversation slowly, speaking about Emily and how proud Laura would have been to see how much she had grown. Daniel nodded warmly and said Emily had been working very hard in school. He repeated again that she was doing well academically and that he believed she would be ready for college in a few years. I listened quietly, letting him finish before gently shifting the conversation toward the reason for our meeting. I told him that over the past few weeks I had been thinking seriously about creating a stronger financial foundation for Emily's future. I explained that the cost of college in the United States had risen dramatically and that I wanted to make sure she had every opportunity available to her. Daniel leaned forward with interest as I spoke. The idea clearly excited him, and he thanked me again for being so generous with my support over the years. That was when I slowly opened the folder that rested on the table between us. Inside were the documents Linda had prepared, neatly arranged in a simple agreement outlining the proposed transfer of $200,000. I slid the first page toward Daniel and explained that the paperwork was simply a formal confirmation of the college fund arrangement. I told him that since the amount was larger than my usual yearly transfer, my financial advisor had suggested documenting it properly to keep everything organized for the future. Daniel glanced over the first page quickly and nodded as if everything seemed perfectly reasonable. He asked a few casual questions about when the transfer would occur and how the funds would be structured. I answered calmly, explaining that once the document was signed, the money would be ready to move into the designated account. As he continued reading through the pages, I noticed that he seemed particularly relaxed. His body language showed no hesitation, and he turned each page with the easy confidence of someone who expected nothing unusual. When he reached the section Linda had added regarding previous financial support, he slowed slightly, but did not stop reading. That section stated clearly that all previous funds provided for Emily's education and living expenses had been used for those purposes. The language was simple and direct. Daniel looked at the line for a moment before lifting his eyes toward me. I kept my expression calm and simply told him the statement was included to keep the documentation consistent with the history of the support I had provided. For a brief moment, the cafe felt very quiet around us. Daniel studied the page again and then nodded slowly as if everything was exactly what he expected. Without asking any further questions, he picked up the pen resting beside the document. As he signed the page confirming the transfer and the use of previous funds, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity settle in my mind. In that single moment, Daniel had willingly confirmed the story he had been telling for years. The signature was simple, just a few strokes of ink on paper, but it revealed how confident he had become in the belief that his explanations would never be challenged. When he finished signing, he handed the pen back to me and smiled again. He thanked me once more for helping secure Emily's future and said she would be incredibly grateful when she learned about the college fund. I nodded politely and closed the folder, letting the moment settle for a few seconds before speaking again. Across the room, I could see Michael and Linda quietly observing the table. Everything had unfolded exactly as planned. Daniel believed the agreement meant the transfer would soon take place. What he did not yet realize was that by signing the document, he had confirmed something far more important than the arrival of new money. He had just placed his name beside a written statement that would soon expose the truth about everything that had happened during the past 7 years. Daniel leaned back in his chair after signing the document and lifted his coffee with a satisfied expression, as if the meeting had gone exactly the way he expected. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hands on the table while studying his face. For 7 years I had believed every explanation he gave me. Now the truth was sitting quietly between us in a few pages of paper. Daniel broke the silence first. He smiled and said he was grateful that Emily had someone like me looking out for her future. He talked about how important education was and how much this support would mean for her college plans. Listening to him say those things felt strange because I knew the words were built on a story that no longer held together. I nodded politely and told him that Emily's future had always been the reason I wanted to help. Then I reached into the folder again and placed another document on the table in front of him. This one looked different from the agreement he had just signed. It contained printed records and notes that Michael and Linda had helped me organize over the past week. Daniel glanced down at the pages with mild curiosity. At first he appeared relaxed, but I could see the moment his expression began to change as he recognized the information in front of him. The first page listed the public record from Westbridge Preparatory School, confirming that Emily had never been enrolled there during the years he claimed she attended. Daniel looked up at me with a puzzled expression as if trying to understand why the information was on the table. Before he could speak, I calmly turned to the second page. That document showed the rental listing history for the townhouse he had repeatedly described as their home. The record clearly indicated that another tenant had occupied the property for the past 8 months. Daniel's posture shifted slightly in his chair. The relaxed confidence he had displayed earlier was beginning to fade. I continued speaking in the same steady tone I had used since the conversation began. I explained that after Emily called me a few weeks earlier, I started verifying a few details about her life. I told him that I had expected to find simple explanations for the differences between what he told me and what Emily described. Instead, the information kept leading to new questions. I turned to the next page in the folder and gently slid it toward him. This page contained the public business registration for Harper Coastal Ventures along with the marina address in Florida and the registration of the recreational boat connected to the company. Daniel stared at the page for several seconds without speaking. The cafe around us continued its quiet afternoon rhythm, but at our table the atmosphere had completely changed. I finally said the words that had been forming in my mind since Emily's phone call. I asked him calmly if he could explain how the money I had sent every year for Emily's education had become connected to a company and marina property hundreds of miles away. Daniel opened his mouth as if preparing to respond, but no words came out at first. He looked again at the documents and then back at me, clearly realizing that the story he had repeated for years could no longer stand without explanation. I did not raise my voice or accuse him directly. Instead, I simply pointed to the agreement he had signed minutes earlier confirming that every dollar I had sent had been used for Emily's education and living expenses. I explained that the signature on that page meant he had personally confirmed that statement in writing. The quiet weight of that realization seemed to settle over him. For a long moment, Daniel sat there looking at the papers spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was much softer than before. He began explaining that he had intended to invest the money to create a better future for Emily, and that the business in Florida had seemed like an opportunity that would grow over time. I listened carefully, but did not interrupt him. The explanation continued for several minutes, as he described how he believed the investments would eventually provide more security for Emily than simply paying school tuition. When he finished, I nodded slowly and told him I understood the idea of investing for the future. But I also reminded him that every year he had told me the money was being used for Emily's school and living expenses, while she and I both believed that was the truth. The conversation ended in a long silence between us. Daniel finally lowered his eyes to the table, understanding that the story he had maintained for 7 years had reached its end. And for the first time since Emily called me that night, the truth was no longer hidden behind polite conversations and reassuring messages. Daniel remained quiet for a long time after our conversation reached that point. The confidence he had shown when he first walked into the cafe was gone, replaced by the expression of someone who understood that the situation had finally caught up with him. I did not raise my voice or argue with him because anger would not change what had already happened. The truth was already sitting in front of us on the table in the form of documents and records that could not be ignored. After several moments, Daniel finally spoke again, but this time his tone sounded very different. He admitted that when he first received the money after Laura passed away, he truly believed he was using it responsibly. He explained that the early investments had seemed like a way to multiply the support I provided so that Emily would eventually have even more opportunities. But as the years passed, the situation slowly changed. Instead of discussing the decisions with me openly, he continued repeating the same explanations about school tuition and living expenses because he believed it would avoid unnecessary conflict. Listening to him describe it that way made me feel both disappointed and strangely calm at the same time. The problem was not simply that he invested the money. The problem was that he allowed the truth to drift further away from what he told me year after year. I told him quietly that if he had come to me honestly and explained his plans to invest the money for Emily's future, the conversation could have been very different. Instead, he chose to let me believe a story that was not accurate, while Emily herself lived with fewer resources than I believed she had. Daniel lowered his eyes again as I said those words. The silence between us lasted long enough that the sound of cups and quiet conversations from other tables began to fill the space around us again. Finally, I closed the folder and explained what would happen next. I told him the $200,000 I mentioned earlier would not be transferred through him. Instead, the money would be placed directly into a protected educational trust under Emily's name. The account would be managed by a financial advisor and structured so that the funds could only be used for her education and future living expenses once she became an adult. I also told him that any future support I provided would follow the same structure. Daniel listened without interrupting. He seemed to understand that the arrangement was not about punishment, but about making sure the support reached the person it was always meant for. Before leaving the cafe, I also explained one more decision I had made during the past few days. I planned to meet Emily later that evening so we could spend time together and talk about her future directly. I wanted her to know that the support I promised her mother would continue, but in a way that made everything clear and secure. Daniel nodded slowly when I told him this. For the first time since the conversation began, he spoke with genuine sincerity. He said that despite everything that had happened, he did care deeply about Emily and wanted her to succeed. I believe that part of what he said was true. When we finally stood up from the table, the meeting ended quietly, without any dramatic confrontation. The truth had already done its work. Later that evening, I met Emily at a small park near her apartment building. She greeted me with the same warm smile that reminded me so much of Laura. As we walked along the path together, I told her about the educational trust and how it would help her pursue any college or career she wanted in the future. Her eyes widened with surprise and gratitude as she listened. In that moment, I felt something I had not felt since the day Laura died. For the first time in years, I knew with complete certainty that the promise I made to protect my granddaughter was finally being fulfilled in the right way. The past 7 years had been filled with trust, mistakes, and difficult realizations, but the future now belonged to Emily. And this time the support meant for her would reach exactly where it was always meant to go.